Uday Hussein was the son of a brutal dictator. His name became tied to cruelty, excess, and terror. Yet in the end, his death came as violent, chaotic, and almost impossible to believe. Uday was born on June 18, 1964 in Baghdad. He was the first son of Saddam Hussein and his cousin wife, Sajida Talfa. Because he was the eldest, many in Iraq believed he would one day inherit his father's throne and rule the country. From the very beginning, he lived in a world where nothing was denied to him. Servants, guards, and advisors surrounded him, always ready to please him. He grew up in palaces filled with gold, marble, and luxury. But he also grew up in an atmosphere of fear. Saddam Hussein was not just a father to Uday. He was the most feared man in Iraq. By the late 1970s, Saddam had become the undisputed ruler of the country. He controlled the army, the government, and the secret police. Everyone from ministers to ordinary citizens lived under his watchful eye. For Uday, this meant he was treated as a prince. And even as a teenager, people around him obeyed his every word. Teachers, relatives, and even military officers could not discipline him because they feared angering Saddam. Unlike his younger brother Qusay, who was quiet and careful, Uday was wild. He craved attention and lived for pleasure. As a young man, he loved showing off his wealth by buying sports cars, wearing expensive clothes, and hosting extravagant parties. But behind the luxury was a darker side. Uday's temper was explosive. Even the smallest insult or mistake could make him lash out in violence. Stories of his cruelty began to spread among those close to the family, and many Iraqis came to see him as even more unpredictable than his father. From his teenage years, Uday showed a hunger for power, but also a lack of control. While Qusay was being trained to handle the intelligence services and the military, Uday was more interested in enjoying his status. Yet because he was Saddam's eldest son, no one dared to challenge him. But this authority didn't last long. In March 2003, the United States, together with Britain and a coalition of allies, launched a full-scale invasion of Iraq known as Operation Iraqi Freedom. The world powers wanted Saddam Hussein gone. They accused him of stockpiling weapons of mass destruction and maintaining secret programs that could threaten not just the Middle East, but the wider world. There were also long-standing claims that his regime had links to terrorism, especially after the September 11 attacks in 2001. On top of this, Saddam had openly defied United Nations resolutions, refusing to fully cooperate with inspectors who were sent to monitor Iraq's weapons capabilities. By 2003, Washington and London insisted that his removal was the only way forward. But Iraq was already weakened long before the first bomb fell. The country had endured a crushing decade of sanctions following the 1991 Gulf War, which left its economy in ruins and its people struggling with shortages of food, medicine, and basic supplies. Saddam's regime remained strong and ruthless, while ordinary Iraqis lived under both international isolation and internal repression. For many, there was no way out. The invasion began on March 20, 2003 with a massive aerial campaign. The first strikes, known as the Shock and Awe bombardment, lit up Baghdad's skies. Explosions thundered across the capital, hitting government buildings, communication centers, and military targets. The attack was designed not only to cripple Iraq's defenses, but also to deliver a psychological blow so powerful that Saddam's regime would crumble quickly. American and British forces advanced rapidly. Within days, southern cities like Basra were under coalition control. U.S. armored divisions pressed towards the capital, meeting resistance from the Iraqi army and paramilitary units loyal to Saddam. But the outcome was never in doubt. Iraq's forces, weakened by years of sanctions and corruption, stood little chance against the modern firepower of the coalition. By April 9th, just 3 weeks after the invasion began, Baghdad had fallen. The world watched live as U.S. forces entered the city. In Firdos Square, one of the most iconic moments of the war unfolded. A massive statue of Saddam Hussein, once a symbol of his absolute power, was dragged down with the help of American troops. Crowds of Iraqis celebrated, some striking the statue with their shoes, an ultimate sign of disrespect in Iraqi culture. Palaces that once stood as untouchable monuments of Saddam's wealth and control were suddenly open for all to see. Gold chandeliers, marble halls, fleets of luxury cars, and piles of cash were uncovered. Ordinary citizens who for decades would not have dared to touch even a chair belonging to the regime now stormed these places. Looters carried away furniture, artwork, and valuables, stripping the symbols of power bare. It was the clearest sign that the Hussein family's dominance had been shattered in a matter of weeks. For Saddam's sons, the fall of Baghdad changed everything. Saddam himself disappeared, moving constantly to avoid capture. Qusay was cautious and relied on trusted bodyguards. Uday, however, was less careful. For years he had been seen as the crown prince of Iraq, the heir who once ruled the streets of Baghdad in convoys of luxury cars, waving pistols out of windows and treating the city like his playground. But now he was no longer a prince, but a fugitive. Instead of roaming the capital, Uday had to move quietly from one safe house to another. His lavish lifestyle of palaces, fast cars, and nightclubs was replaced with fear, hiding, and betrayal. Neighbors and even relatives were now potential informants. Everyone knew there was a price on his head. The U.S. military wanted him badly. Along with Saddam and Qusay, Uday was placed on the most wanted list created by the Pentagon. To make it easier for soldiers in the field, American commanders designed a special deck of playing cards with faces of regime figures printed on them. Each card showed one target, and the most dangerous men were placed at the top. Saddam was the ace of spades, Qusay was the ace of clubs, Uday was the ace of hearts. For soldiers, it turned a deadly mission into a clear game of identification. But for the Hussein family, it was a sign that their days were numbered. The hunters were closing in. American forces began spreading across Iraq, raiding homes, searching farms, and questioning anyone who might have information. Many Iraqis who had lived under Saddam's rule for decades were now eager to cooperate. Some did it for money. Others did it out of anger and revenge. Families who had lost loved ones in Saddam's prisons or athletes who had been beaten under Uday's orders now saw a chance to strike back by helping the Americans. By the summer of 2003, the U.S. had already captured many key figures from Saddam's inner circle. One of the most important was Ali Hassan al-Majid, better known as Chemical Ali, Saddam's cousin, who was responsible for ordering poison gas attacks on Kurdish villages in the 1980s. Alongside him, dozens of bodyguards, generals, and Ba'ath Party officials were also caught. Each capture brought new information, like pieces of a puzzle slowly fitting together. The net around Saddam's family was getting smaller every day. Intelligence reports suggested that Uday and Qusay were constantly on the move. They never stayed long in one place because they feared betrayal. But by July 2003, the trail led north to Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. Mosul was known for having tribes and families still loyal to the Hussein family, making it a natural hiding spot. It was in Mosul that Uday and Qusay found shelter inside a villa owned by Nawaf al-Zaidan, a family relative by marriage. The villa was large with tall walls and a strong gate, but it was not enough to protect them forever. Someone close to the family betrayed their location. U.S. intelligence received word from an informant who claimed to have seen them inside the villa. This was not just a rumor. It was a direct confirmation that Saddam's sons were hiding there. For months, the Americans had been searching without success. Now at last, they had their breakthrough. The hunt that had started with chaos in Baghdad was about to reach its climax in Mosul. The noose around Uday and Qusay was tightening, and there was no way out. But the Americans knew that these two men would not surrender quietly. The morning of July 22, 2003 began quietly in Mosul. Around 10 a.m., U.S. forces closed in on the villa. This was not a regular patrol. It was a carefully planned mission. Leading the operation was Task Force 20, a secretive special operations unit made up of some of the most highly trained soldiers in the U.S. military. Alongside them were troops from the 101st Airborne Division, who provided additional firepower and support. Together, they surrounded the house from all sides, determined not to let anyone escape. Loudspeakers were used to call on the people inside to surrender. The soldiers shouted for them to come out with their hands up. For a moment, there was complete silence. No doors opened, no one moved. The Americans waited, hoping the standoff would end peacefully. But inside the villa, Uday and Hussein had already made their choice. They would not be taken alive. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from the house. Bullets ripped through windows and walls, forcing the Americans to take cover. The villa instantly turned into a battlefield. The gunfire was not just from Uday and Hussein. With them was Mustafa, Hussein's 14-year-old son, who also picked up a weapon to fight alongside his father and uncle. In that moment, 3 generations of Saddam's bloodline were trapped inside the villa, facing overwhelming American firepower, but refusing to give up. What began as a simple raid had now turned into a siege. The Americans realized this was not going to be quick or easy. The men inside were determined to fight to the death, and the battle for the villa had only just begun. The first few minutes of the battle were pure chaos. Gunfire ripped through the wooden doors and smashed out the glass windows. Sparks flew off the villa's gates as rounds struck the metal. Inside the villa, Uday and Hussein had turned the home into a fortress. They were not hiding under beds or cowering in corners. They had rifles, machine guns, and plenty of ammunition. They had positioned themselves in different parts of the house, making it hard for U.S. forces to rush in without being cut down. Every blast of gunfire from inside was a signal that these men were not going to surrender easily. For Uday, this moment carried a bitter edge. He had grown up surrounded by weapons. Since childhood, he had been given the best training from Iraq's top military officers. Guns, grenades, and rockets were toys he was allowed to play with, long before most children even learned how to ride a bicycle. He had always believed weapons made him untouchable. Now, in his final hours, that belief was put to the test. He fired relentlessly at the enemy, each trigger pull buying him a few more moments of life. The American troops outside quickly saw that this was not going to be a simple raid. They had expected resistance, but not the kind of ferocity coming from inside this house. Uday and Hussein were fighting like men who had already accepted that they would die. Within minutes, U.S. commanders decided to bring in heavier weapons. Apache helicopters appeared in the sky, circling low over the neighborhood. These machines were built for combat, and their presence showed the seriousness of the situation. On the ground, Bradley fighting vehicles rolled into place. Each one carried powerful cannons capable of tearing through concrete. What had started as a raid to capture fugitives was turning into a full-scale urban battle. The neighborhood, normally a quiet area of Mosul, transformed into a war zone. Families who had been preparing lunch or going about their morning routines were suddenly caught in the middle of it. Neighbors hit the floor of their homes as the crack of rifles and the boom of explosions echoed across the streets. Parents pulled their children close, terrified of stray bullets. Some civilians ran out with nothing but the clothes on their back, desperate to escape the crossfire. There was no escape. Inside the villa, Uday and Hussein understood the situation. The house was surrounded. The enemy had superior firepower. There was no escape. Still, they made their choice clear. To them, dying in a firefight was better than facing the humiliation of being dragged out alive and paraded in front of the world. Minutes turned into hours. The Americans tightened their cordon around the villa, cutting off every possible escape route. Then they began unleashing heavier and heavier firepower. The U.S. soldiers fired tow missiles, weapons designed to destroy tanks, directly into the villa. Entire rooms were blown apart in seconds. The rattle of heavy machine guns followed, chewing through the walls. Anti-tank rounds, meant to pierce steel armor, tore through the building's structure. Every hit shook the neighborhood, and bystanders blocks away could feel the vibrations. Inside the villa, Uday and Qusay continued firing back. Despite the collapsing walls and smoke filling the rooms, they refused to stop. Uday in particular seemed determined to make his last stand. His body was not strong anymore. Back in 1996, he had survived an assassination attempt in Baghdad when gunmen ambushed his car. He was hit with more than a dozen bullets, leaving his spine and leg badly damaged. Since then, he walked with a limp and lived with constant pain. But on this day, in Mosul, he fought as though none of those injuries mattered. Fueled by rage and desperation, he poured bullets out of his rifle, each shot a message that he would not go quietly. The villa shook from explosions, but the sound of gunfire kept coming from inside. Even as the roof began to cave in and smoke filled every corner, Uday kept pulling the trigger. He was determined to make his enemies work for every inch, even if it meant dying in the rubble. After nearly 4 hours of non-stop gunfire, rockets, and explosions, the villa that had once been a symbol of luxury was reduced to ruins. Walls that had been painted and decorated to show off wealth were now cracked and falling apart. Smoke poured out of broken windows, filling the neighborhood with the smell of fire and gunpowder. Entire sections of the roof had caved in, and the inside of the house looked more like a battlefield than a home. They had already thrown everything at the villa, and this last push was meant to end it once and for all. Helicopters roared overhead, and soldiers on the ground closed in. Heavy firepower tore through what was left of the house. The noise was deafening. Inside, Uday Hussein had reached his end. He had been shot several times, his body broken by the constant blasts. For years he had acted without fear, believing no one could touch him. He had lived as if he were above all laws, surrounded by riches, women, and power. But now all of that was gone. He was cornered, bleeding, and helpless in the ruins of his own stronghold. Uday's death was far from peaceful. He was torn apart by bullets and shrapnel, his last moments filled with chaos and pain. The man who once tortured athletes for losing games, who drove through Baghdad in gold-plated cars, and who ruled with cruelty, now died in the dirt and rubble of a burning house. His fall showed the world that even those who seem untouchable can be brought down, and that his years of violence had ended in violence of the worst kind. Qusay and his teenage son would also die in that house, refusing to give themselves up. The dynasty was collapsing in blood. When the gunfire finally stopped, American soldiers carefully stepped inside, moving through piles of debris and smoldering rooms. The air was thick with dust and the smell of gunpowder. In the ruins, they found the bodies of Uday and Qusay Hussein, along with Qusay's teenage son Mustafa. The discovery was more than just a military success. It was a symbolic moment. Since the fall of Baghdad in April, rumors had spread across Iraq that Saddam and his sons were still in hiding, waiting to rise again. Many Iraqis lived in fear, wondering if the old regime would somehow return. But with Uday and Qusay dead, that shadow of uncertainty began to fade. The myth of their invincibility was gone. The US military worked quickly to prove to the world that the men were truly dead. Their bodies were photographed, fingerprinted, and confirmed through dental records. The next day, on July 23, 2003, the announcement was made publicly. The images of Uday and Qusay's lifeless faces were broadcast worldwide, leaving no doubt. For Iraqis who'd suffered under Uday's cruelty, the news brought relief. This was the man accused of torture, rape, and murder. The man whose sadistic pleasures were whispered in fear. Now he was gone.